These are the things that do not work for me when it comes down to fat loss. It doesn't mean that they won't work for other people. It doesn't mean that they're inherently wrong. It doesn't mean that they're even scientifically wrong. I've just been doing this for a very long time and I've figured out what works for me. But arguably the more important thing is to know what doesn't work for me. And I want to be able to share that because I know a lot of people try to emulate what I do. And even though I'm not the same as you, you might be able to learn something or maybe pick up one or two things. So I'm going to jump right into the first one. The first thing that does not work for me is eating more than 3 or 4 meals per day. Even if I'm in a caloric deficit, I just don't feel right. And when I'm wearing a continuous glucose monitor, my glucose is high all day when I do that. And there's a good chance that I've just conditioned myself to be really good at utilizing minimal fuels or going so often in a time-restricted feeding like intermittent fasting fashion that I just don't thrive eating multiple times per day. It just comes down to it. After like 3 or 4 meals, I feel bloated and I truly have a hard time staying lean. I feel like I retain water. I've gotten to a point now where I can consolidate my calories into a 4, 6 hour, 8 hour eating window pretty regularly and not have a huge problem. I feel like I stay leaner that way and I have less water retention. Now the next one is a very important piece because it has to do with intermittent fasting. The next thing that does not work for me when it comes down to fat loss is fasting every day. There was a period of my life when I was going through my 100-pound transformation where yes, like I fasted almost every day. If I fast every day nowadays, I feel weak, I feel like I start retaining water again, and I find it easier to put fat on. And I've talked about this in various videos, but it comes down to fasting being an anomaly. I want fasting to be a shock. So if I normally eat 2 or 3 meals per day, just kind of throughout the day, and then 2 or 3 times per week, aggressively restrict calories with fasting, it maintains its effectiveness and it keeps me lean. If I start fasting too much, it just doesn't work. It does not apply the same effect anymore. The next thing that I found with me is anything over about 150 grams of carbohydrates per day on a very high carb day for me, that just becomes too much. I have found that my tolerable upper intake is about 150 grams. Now, what does that really mean? Well, that's a very, very specific thing. But I feel like in a state of authenticity and kind of sharing what works and what doesn't, that's just where the line is for me. After that, I'm very brain foggy. My glucose stays very high. Now you have to factor in the equation that when I was very, very overweight before, I made myself type 2 diabetic during that period of time. So we have to acknowledge that I probably still pay a little bit of a price for that. Meaning I probably do not manage glucose super well. That's not something that you can just like reverse overnight. It's been 10 years and I think I still pay a price for it. But that being said, I know I'm talking to a lot of people that deal with the same kind of thing. So I've found that maybe it's an arbitrary number, but like anything over 150, 160, it goes downhill from there. I also notice that even when I'm trying to drop body fat, it's like if my carbs are super high, I just have a harder time. Again, that's totally independent. That could just be me, but it's worth mentioning. The next thing that seems to stand in the way, and I know I can't say it stands in the way of fat loss, but indirectly it does, is any kind of MSG. When I eat MSG, it messes up my sleep for days. Okay, now do I have science to back it up? I have rodent model data to back it up. I mean, I have seen data pretty clear with rodents, but it doesn't mean it works with humans. That basically the lighting up of the brain that happens from MSG, because it's sort of excitatory, it tilts the brain towards its glutamate scale, affects their sleep and it affects their appetite. It can affect all kinds of things. I notice that with me. I feel like it lights my brain up so much that I'm craving food for days and I don't sleep for a couple of days. I'm that sensitive to it. And again, maybe that's just me, but it also falls in line with like these hyperpalatable foods, right? It's like we're always bombarded with foods that activate our reward sensors so much that we need to constantly be seeking out that same sort of dopamine hit. And I find that MSG just kind of stands in the way of that. It does not mean that it will do it to you. Like MSG, I can't find any data that demonstrates that it's unsafe or unhealthy, but what it does to the brain is pretty clear because that's the whole idea of it. The next one I found is that eating a low meat diet just doesn't really work well for me. Like I can survive, I can feel pretty good mentally, but even if I am getting the same amount of protein from like protein shakes or from even yogurt, and things like that. Like I can get that protein in, but it's not the same. Like maybe it's the lack of creatine that's in red meat. Maybe it's the lack of various amino acids that I would get out of meat. Maybe it's the lack of leucine that I'm, not getting from meat if I'm going low meat, but I've tried it. I've tried vegetarian. I've done stints where I've even done vegan for the sake of content, not because I really wanted to, but because I wanted to experiment with it. But I've also just reduced meat just to see, hey, like what happens if I try to get more protein in, but reduce the meat consumption? My strength goes down, consequently my workout performance goes down, consequently my calories out goes down because my energy expenditure goes down. I feel cold. I don't feel like I'm getting a thermic effect like I normally do, and my sleep suffers. And it's just, I've grown to accept that maybe I just need to have meat in my diet, and maybe it's a result of having some muscle on me, maybe it's a result of being very active. But my advice would be, if you're an active person, there's probably a good chance you need more protein and possibly a good chance you need more meat. Maybe it's just the way that it is, but who am I to say? I'm just a dude on the internet, right? Side note, personal level, I get a lot of my meat from ButcherBox, which I put a link down below. They are an online meat delivery company, so they have really good cuts of meat. Now, when I talk about some of these other things that I'm going to talk about, it'll make sense why I do this, but I usually opt for their leaner cuts. I go for like their fillets. I go for their leaner New York steaks. I go for a lot of their chicken. I go for a lot of their flank steaks, and I really like their like stew cuts that you can put in stew and things like that. Anyway, it's all grass-fed, grass-finished. I popped a link down below. I don't want to make this contrived. That's not the idea here. I just like to share things that I do that also make sense because they've been a sponsor on this channel for a long time, and a good majority of the meat that I eat is now through ButcherBox because it's what I consider to be the highest quality. So that link is down below. That gets you some of the cuts that I would typically choose, and then they get delivered to your doorstep. And there is a free ground life for a year promotion going on. So when you sign up with ButcherBox, you get ground beef throughout the entirety of your membership with ButcherBox, which is pretty cool. So that link is down below. Now, interestingly enough, the next one that I found that just doesn't work for me is doing fed workouts in the morning. Okay, I will work out with food in my system sometimes. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not like a monster that only works out fasted. But when it comes to morning time, I just need to be fasted. Like, I find like if I start eating meals right when I roll out of bed, I'm just eating too early in the day, and that's just starting my calorie load like too early on. So by the end of the day, I've ultimately consumed more calories because I'm rolling out of bed at like 5:30 a.m. and I work out shortly thereafter. So if I'm eating before I work out, that means I'm eating at like 5:30 a.m., which means I'm starting my eating window like way earlier than I normally do. Plus, my workouts feel like garbage because I don't think I've fully digested. But also, I think my body is just adapted to training in a fasted state. I legitimately feel, and I know the evidence is pretty like split, right? Like it's like people that train in a fed state usually can feel like they work out a little harder and they get similar benefits to those that work out in a fasted state. I don't necessarily think one is better or worse. You have to do what works for you. But man, I will tell you, it doesn't work for me. Like even so much as like if my workouts in the afternoon are in a fed state, it's a struggle. Like mentally, I'm not there. I think something about being in a fasted state when I train, I feel like maybe that fight or flight kicks in where it's like survival. It's like, I gotta go. I gotta do this workout. I'm on fire. My brain's going. And I just like that feeling. So when I start eating before my workouts, like if I was robotic, sure, I could still lose fat, but I find it much more difficult for me because my calories are more and my workouts are sluggish. The next one is kind of weird and it's gonna ruffle some feathers, but it's not to say that you don't go out and eat this stuff. Personally, if I eat a high saturated fat diet, I find it hard for me to lose fat. Now, there's a couple of potential reasons why. For one, I notice that when I increase saturated fat intake, that my glucose is higher. And there are reasons behind that. It makes sense. Like saturated fat in tandem with carbohydrates can drive up glucose, but I don't think I'm having that much. The only thing that I can explain is that I think saturated fats are very easy for me to overeat. So I notice when I start adding saturated fats in by way of like fattier cuts of meat, which is why I opt for lean cuts, or I start having like, I don't know, tasty keto snacks that are saturated fat or something like that, I tend to A, probably eat too much, but B, I think there is something metabolic going on. So what I typically do is I try to have about 20% of my fat calories come from saturated fat, maybe 25%. The rest I get from monounsaturated fats, from polyunsaturated fats, like fish oils and healthy fish, fatty fish, things like that. Does this mean it's going to be the case for you? No. Like, I know plenty of people and really good friends that do carnivore that eat copious amounts of saturated fat, and their blood work is beautiful and they are lean and they look great. Where I think we have to draw the line is, like, if people are not doing a zero carb or a very, very low carb diet, then saturated fat might be an encumbrance if it's over like that 20-30% total fat intake. The next one, and people are going to hate me for this too because it's going to sound like I'm being dogmatic, but I got to be honest. If I consume a bunch of seed oils, I don't feel good and I become inflamed and I feel like it's harder to stay lean. That being said, the inflammation, the water retention could be just masquerading my leanness. So maybe I'm just as lean, maybe I'm just holding water. But I don't want to throw all seed oils under the bus. Like, I know as much as the next guy that, like, the arachidonic acid path, like, when you have omega-6s, that does not necessarily mean you're automatically driving up inflammation. Omega-6s are just as important for reduction of inflammation, like IL-10, as they are for driving up inflammation. So I don't think that's the case. The best explanation that I have is, typically if I'm having seed oils that are not in a controlled fashion, I'm having them probably in the way of restaurant food or crappy salad dressings or things that are slipping their way in there. And those are going to be the rancid oils. So I think the problem actually comes from the oxidation, from the oxidized, like, rancid oils. I personally don't think that seed oils are a huge, huge issue if they're in their clean, non-oxidized form. Where we run into an issue, and I've talked about this before, is good luck finding clean seed oils, right? The cleanest way you're going to find them is going to be like fresh off the plant in like their raw nut form, right? Or raw seed form. So we run into that serious issue with that. So that's why I try to get fats from like monounsaturated fat. So I go like olive oil, I go avocado oil, I go macadamia nuts, I go macadamia nut oil. So I get monounsaturated fats, which are much more stable than polyunsaturated fats from even nuts and seeds and seed oils. Doesn't mean I don't eat nuts and seeds. It means that I don't like electively add seed oils to my diet, because I just think the risk of having a rancid oil probably outweighs the benefit when there are other options you could choose, right? So I don't want to demonize it. I just think there's better options. This one is going to turn some heads and it's going to get people a little confused. So I'm going to give a disclaimer. I am not a type 2 diabetic. I was clinically, by blood work standards, about 10 or 11 years ago. But right now I would consider myself still a healthy individual. This doesn't necessarily apply for type 2 diabetics. If I have too much in the way of low glycemic carbs, earlier in the day, I have a harder time staying lean and I have a harder time keeping my blood glucose under control. Why is this? My theory is that by having low glycemic carbs early in the day, it's like I have a gentle bell curve of blood sugar that never gets a chance to really go down, followed by another gentle bell curve on top of that. And then as the day goes on, if I eat lots of low glycemic carbs, they pile up on top of each other. So if I'm going to have carbs, I typically have carbs that I can control pretty quick. So I'll have things like a red potato, or literally even a sweet potato is pretty high glycemic in the grand scheme of things. And what I find is that if I can control the blood sugar spike and my body is healthy, that spike comes back down the way that it should. You run into this problem with people that are insulin resistant or diabetic because they have a big spike and they don't come back down. If you are healthy and you have a spike and it comes back down, that's exactly what your body's supposed to do. So I almost control these shorter spikes with higher glycemic, moderate to high glycemic carbs, rather than having moderately low glycemic piling on top of each other. But again, full disclaimer, that is in a healthy individual. I think a type 2 diabetic or an insulin resistant person should pay attention to glycemic index and glycemic load, absolutely. And the last one simply does not work for me, and I've tried it left, right, and center, and that is eating anytime within 2 hours before bed. I am sorry, but my sleep is invariably disrupted if I do that. Now, I find sometimes if I have a little bit of protein an hour before bed, it might help me sleep. But what I've found is that that's only if my protein has not been high enough throughout the day. And there's data to back that up. Demonstrates that if your protein needs are not met, it affects sleep. People do not tend to sleep as well if they did not get enough protein that day. So is it the protein before bed, increasing tryptophan, melatonin, all that? Maybe, but it's probably more so the days that I have protein before bed and it helps me sleep are days that I didn't get enough to begin with, which is why I'd be adding it in anyway. So otherwise, no matter how I spin it, like I was on a trip last week And like I was in a hotel and I would get back to the hotel closer to bedtime and I'd have a little snack or eat a little something, constantly like disrupting my sleep. And this happens at home too. So I know this is what works for me, but hopefully you can learn a couple of things and put tools in your toolbox in place to avoid these situations that are an encumbrance to your fat loss. I'll see you tomorrow.